Assalamu alaikum, salam to everyone everywhere. Today we have a urgent and critical discussion called the Displacement and Resettlement in Gaza, Historical Context and Contemporary Realities. My name is Hala Sabah. I'm honored to be here. I am the founder of Siyaq Solutions, a diversity and inclusion organization that focuses on the SWANA organization, the SWANA communities. And I'm also the co-founder of the Samir Project, a Palestinian-led mutual aid group in Gaza. Before we begin, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us today for this really important dialogue and in this really, really troubling time full of uncertainty. We come together to reflect on the past, analyze the present, and strategize for the future. The issue of displacement in Gaza is not new. It's part of a long-standing history of attempts to erase Palestinians from their land, an ongoing colonial project that Palestinians have resisted for decades. The urgency of today's discussion is underscored by the recent statements from the US President, Donald Trump, who openly called for the forced displacement of Palestinians from Gaza and their resettlement elsewhere. This rhetoric is not just dangerous, it's part of a broader pattern of policies and strategies aimed at depopulating Gaza, dismantling its geographic and demographic significance, and erasing its role in the Palestinian struggle. And this is why today's conversation is really, really important. Today, together, we will explore the historical context of these displacement efforts, the political motivations behind them, and most importantly, how Palestinians have continued to resist and defy these schemes. From the resettlement plans of the 1950s to today's catastrophic genocide on Gaza. By understanding this history, we can better comprehend the stakes of the present and the urgent need to mobilize against the escalating calls for ethnic cleansing. We are very grateful to have two esteemed speakers who bring deep expertise and lived experience to this discussion. I will start by introducing Hadil El-Asali, an anthropologist and former engineer whose work critically examines the colonial legacies of geology and displacement in Palestine. Additionally, we have Jihad Abu Salim, the executive director of the Institute for Palestine Studies in the United States, and the co-editor of Light in Gaza, Writing Born of Fire, whose research focuses on the history of Gaza and Palestinian resistance to displacement. We will hear from both these speakers, followed by a moderated discussion and a Q&A session. So please feel free, if you have any questions throughout this discussion, to put them in the chat. And before we begin, I want to remind everyone that we are here to engage in a constructive and respectful discussion. This is a space for critical dialogue, learning, and solidarity. With that, I'd like to begin by inviting Jihad Abu Salim to share his insights on the historical frameworks and colonial legacies of displacement in Gaza. Go ahead, Jihad.
Thank you so much, Hala. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to share a brief presentation with you all, exploring resettlement plans that were designed in the 1950s and put them in the context of the Nakba and its continuation in the Gaza Strip. And after that, we'll pass it to Hadil, who's going to talk about later resettlement plans. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Actually, let me. Okay. Can you see the full presentation? Okay, so thank you so much, Hala, for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone to today's event and discussion on the displacement and resettlement plans of the Gaza Strip. The statements made by US President Donald Trump with regards to the mass ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the welcome those statements received from Israeli government officials, leaders, and from large sectors of the Israeli public, as recent polls have shown. These ideas for resettling Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, removing them from the refugee camps of Gaza, and thinning out the population of the Gaza Strip, whether through direct, genocidal campaigns similar to the one we have just experienced and still continues and unfolds, or through schemes and plans to remove the refugees from Gaza and resettle them in other places. These are not new ideas. They have been presented and discussed multiple times from the moment the Gaza Strip emerged as a geographic and demographic entity following the Nakba of 1948. Before I talk about one of the early plans to resettle Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip, I'm going to just give a brief history and context about the Gaza Strip itself. And in order for us to understand the reality in the Gaza Strip today and over the past 76 years, it is important to reflect on what is the Gaza Strip and how did the Gaza Strip come to being. And when we say the Gaza Strip, what do we mean? The key context, of course, when it comes to understanding Gaza's current reality and the past 76 years is understanding how the Gaza Strip as a geographic entity has been shaped by the events of 1948, the Palestinian Nakba, the event that led to the establishment of the State of Israel and the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees from their cities, towns, and villages. In this context, the pre-1948 Gaza subdistrict, which you see in dark green here, which was a subdistrict of Mandate Palestine, which spanned an area of 430 square miles and included 3 major cities, including Gaza, Al-Majdal, and Khan Yunis, and 54 more villages. This subdistrict, which also was part of a larger Gaza district, which I will show the map here. The map here shows both to the left, the Gaza district of Mandate Palestine, then in the middle, the Gaza subdistrict, and to the right, you see the Bi'r al-Saba subdistrict, and both Bi'r al-Saba and Gaza subdistricts were part of the larger Gaza district. And this Gaza district included Gaza and the Nakba and covered a total area of approximately 5,300 square miles with open borders and no physical separation. So the pre-1948 Gaza district was contiguous, open, and Palestinians lived there for centuries before. Gaza City, of course, here served as the center of economic and administrative life for the residents of the Gaza district and the Gaza subdistrict. Now, in the century-long genocidal assault on Palestinians starts with the First World War, when the British conquer Gaza, established a mandate, and during that war, the old city of Gaza, most of its neighborhoods and communities and ancient buildings were destroyed. You can see here a photo of the Great Omari Mosque in Gaza, which was destroyed during the First World War. And the image of the destruction of the Great Mosque then resembles the destruction of the mosque that happened during the recent genocidal assault that Israel waged against the Gaza Strip. This is another photo of the ruins of Gaza City following the British occupation. Now, fast forward to the Nakba. The Nakba is an important event that shaped and continues to reshape reality in Gaza and in all of Palestine, but in Gaza in particular. And this is because the Nakba represents a profound rupture in Palestinian social, political, cultural, and economic life, and with its effect still felt in the present. In the Gaza area, as the map to the right shows, this territory that we call today the Gaza Strip did not emerge out of the blue. It emerged as a result of the influx, the movement, the forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees from areas close or near Gaza City. So that when hostilities ended during that war, this new entity called the Gaza Strip emerges. In this photo, you see a rare color picture of a Shati, the beach refugee camp west of Gaza City. Now, this process of the emergence of the Gaza Strip as this new geographic entity in a manner that has been unprecedented in Palestinian history was violent, of course, due to the Nakba and the events that ensued during the Nakba. But those realities that emerged in 1948 and 1949 were not meant to be temporary. And this is why when Israel and Egypt, and this concerns Gaza here, when they signed the armistice agreement in February 1949, it was understood that this armistice demarcation line, which would later would become the boundary for the so-called two-state solution. But we're talking about that era now. The armistice demarcation line was not to be construed in any sense as a political or territorial boundary. The photo to the left is striking here because this is the Gaza-Jerusalem road. And it shows how this geographic separation between Gaza and the rest of Palestine, between Gaza and the remaining Palestinian cities and towns began as a result of the Nakba. This fence that surrounds the Gaza Strip today is not a fact of life or history. It started like this, with these small barriers, with these bushes that are placed on roads that ensured that Palestine was and has always been a contiguous place, of course, up until the establishment of the State of Israel. To give perspective about the proximity of Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip to their homes, towns, cities, and villages and communities from which they were expelled in 1948 and that were taken away from them during the Nakba, this photo I find incredibly striking because it shows here the northernmost part of the Gaza Strip. And this photo, I believe, was taken during the 2021 war or a previous aggression on the Gaza Strip. But it shows here, Palestinian communities in Gaza, mostly refugees. And to the north, it shows the Rotenberg power plant, which is in Asdod, in what is today the State of Israel. And this shows how close people are in Gaza to the cities and villages and neighborhoods from which they were expelled in 1948. In Gaza, you don't need a monument for the Nakba because every day when you wake up, you go to the roof of your house, you sit on the balcony, you look north, you look east, and you see the lands that your ancestors owned for generations, the lands that your ancestors farmed and lived on and led their economic, social, and cultural life lives for hundreds of years, and you are reminded that you, number one, your parents and grandparents were expelled from there, that even though that you still own the deeds to this land, that doesn't mean anything because Israel took it from you by force. And of course, it adds insult to the historical injury of the Nakba, in the sense that Palestinians in Gaza are able to see that Israeli communities surrounding the Gaza Strip are prosperous. They have, they're leading comfortable lives, while Palestinians in Gaza are trapped in refugee camps. This is the power plant here, the chimneys that I just showed. And from anywhere in northern Gaza, you can basically like look north. So if you live in a place like Jabalia refugee camp, where the population density is around 110,000 people per 1 square mile or kilometer, and then you're looking north and you see that the population density in these areas on the other side of the fence range from 0 to 500 human being per square kilometer, you wonder to yourself how this reality has been normalized and accepted. So this is the context in which the Gaza Strip emerges. Gaza emerges as a result, the Gaza Strip emerges as a product of the Nakba. Most people in the Gaza Strip come from towns and villages in the vicinity or surrounding the Gaza Strip. This excellent visual from Visualizing Palestine, a great organization that I highly recommend people supporting. It shows that most refugees in the Gaza Strip come from 190 villages across Palestine. They live in 8 refugee camps. Most of these camps were destroyed during this genocide. We're talking about Jabalia, Shati, we're talking about Rafah and Yunus. Those refugee camps suffered huge destruction as a result of Israel's genocidal war on Gaza. These are the names of the villages and towns and cities where Palestinian refugees in Gaza originally descend from. Now, let's talk about this context is important, because without this context, we can't really fully grasp and understand what the early resettlement plans were and how Palestinians dealt with them. And in order to understand that, we need to look at Gaza under Egyptian rule, a period that spanned between 1948 and 1967. And this period was characterized by these 3 major themes. Gaza under Egyptian rule was not annexed. Gaza was not considered a part of Egypt. Egypt did not perceive Gaza as Egyptian territory. And under Egyptian rule, Palestinians in Gaza, refugees, non-refugees, Palestinian communities there, led key efforts for the revival and preservation of Palestinian nationalism and national institutions after the Nakba. Gaza becomes a center for the struggle for return and liberation. And Palestinians in Gaza actively rejected resettlement plans and schemes that were proposed during that period. And in Gaza, the Palestinian flag was raised, despite that it was under Egyptian rule. Palestinian institutions such as the Palestinian Legislative Council and other Palestinian national institutions continued to exist and to be active. In this photo to the right, you can see a training camp for the Palestine Liberation Army, which was stationed in Gaza. And even though it was those Palestinian volunteers were receiving military training by Egyptian officers, the flag that they raised was a Palestinian flag, contrary to some of the myths that Zionists circulate that Palestinian identity and nationalism emerged in 1965 with the establishment of the PLO and so on. Additionally, Gaza becomes a hub for anti-colonial, third world transnational anti-colonial struggles and movements. Gaza is visited by key anti-colonial figures such as Che Guevara, Malcolm X, and in Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza lead massive efforts to fundraise, even though symbolically, for anti-colonial struggles such as in Algeria. So Gaza becomes this hub for anti-colonial politics, not just with regards to Palestine, but also vis-a-vis the anti-colonial movement in the Arab world and so on. Now, one of the legacies of the Egyptian monarchy and the Farouk era government and its approach to dealing with the Palestine question that even continued under the free officers, at least in the first 2 or 3 years after the July Revolution in Egypt, was the idea that some Palestinian refugees in Gaza could potentially be resettled in parts of the Sinai. This project, the Northwest Sinai Project, which was introduced in 1953 and was just an idea that was explored between UNRWA and Egypt, it was one of those early ideas to explore the possibility of moving Palestinian refugees from Gaza to a part of the Sinai. Now, the timeline for this project is as follows. In October 1953, Egypt and UNRWA signed a project survey agreement to explore resettling 10,000 Palestinian refugee families on 50,000 faddans of irrigated farmland in northwestern Sinai. Egypt's motivation for that project was purely humanitarian and economic, because Egypt was responsible for the Gaza Strip and it did not have the capacity or the ability, and the Gaza Strip did not have the economic potential around that time to support the people who were living there. People were living in really difficult, the 1948 refugees were living in really difficult conditions. And this idea was raised by UNRWA and officials who, Egyptian officials, especially from the Farouk era, King Farouk era, decided on exploring it. So in June 1953, UNRWA allocated $30 million for refugee self-support projects, including $500,000 for a feasibility study on using Nile water to irrigate the northwestern part of the Sinai. Between 1953 and 1955, this joint Egyptian UNRWA survey was conducted, and with the goal of assessing irrigation, soil conditions, agricultural potential, and refugee rehabilitation plans in northwestern part of the Sinai Peninsula. The plan was completed in July of 1955, and it confirmed the technical feasibility of the project, but highlighted certain challenges that I will discuss briefly. Now, this plan was only explored in theory. There was no actual effort on the part of Egypt or UNRWA or any international body that pushed for the implementation of this plan. However, even though it was examined as theoretically as a possibility, the plan immediately faced Palestinian opposition from within Gaza, and I will talk about this in a moment. In order to understand how Palestinians rejected the Northwestern Sinai project, we have to examine another key event that happened in the mid-50s, which was the Operation Black Arrow, which led also to the end of this Northwestern Sinai project. In February 1928, on February 28, 1955, Israeli forces conducted an operation against the Gaza Strip, against Egyptian forces stationed in the Gaza Strip. Israeli paratroopers units crossed the armistice line and attacked Egyptian outposts and killed 40 Egyptian soldiers. Israel claimed that this was in retaliation for Palestinian Fidaiyin crossing the border. However, the scale of this Israeli attack on Egyptian forces stationed in the Gaza Strip was the largest cross-border operation by Israel at that time. This led to increased tensions between Egypt and Israel, and it eventually triggered a wave of protests that basically in Gaza that condemned this Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip, and also intensified calls for greater defense measures on political freedoms by Palestinians in Gaza. And most importantly, it led to Egypt reassess its security policies in the Gaza Strip, and most importantly as well, it brought an end to any possibility for pursuing any resettlement plans in Gaza. This is a newspaper photo. It's not clear. It shows the aftermath of the Israeli attack on the Gaza Strip in 1955. So let's talk about how Palestinians in Gaza, in the context of this Northwest Sinai project and of Operation Black Arrow in the mid-50s, opposed this plan and resisted these attempts to resettle Palestinian refugees. So on March 1st, 1955, Gaza was a city on edge. There's the resettlement plan, there's the attack on February 28, 1955 by Israel. The streets of Gaza were boiling with anger. And just the day before, as I mentioned, Israeli forces launched Operation Black Arrow, killing around 40 Egyptian soldiers stationed in Gaza. Palestinians took to the streets in the Gaza Strip in the thousands in an unprecedented event since the Nakba. And their protest on March 1st, 1955, which Palestinians recall and remember as the March 1955 uprising, one of the early uprisings in Gaza after the Nakba. Their protest was not just about the attack. It was about something much deeper. The protest addressed decades of displacement, frustration, and fear of being permanently exiled from Palestine. And all of this led to the March 1955 uprising in Gaza. The people of Gaza, as I mentioned, many of them refugees from 1948, have heard rumors for months that there are plans to resettle them in northwestern Sinai, taking them even further away from their homeland. The Palestinian refugees in Gaza refused to let that happen. And they poured into the streets, thousands of them, and they chanted, "We reject resettlements, O agents of the Americans. لا توطين ولا إسكان يا عملاء الأمريكان." And they also chanted, "They wrote the Sinai Project with ink, and we will erase it by blood." As Palestinians were flooding the streets of Gaza, chaos and confrontation took place. This protest was unlike anything Gaza has seen before. It wasn't just a demonstration, it was an uprising. The people were no longer just demanding better conditions in the camps. They were now fighting for their future, their identity, and their right of return. The 1955 uprising in Gaza was led by many activists and leaders in Gaza. The most important of them was Mouin Bsesso, a Palestinian poet and activist whose words would later immortalize this uprising. Mouin Bsesso, along with other leaders, helped channel Palestinians' rage into something bigger, a demand for action, not just outrage. Protesters demanded weapons to fight Israel and defend themselves. They called for the establishment of a Palestinian force to protect Gaza. And most of all, their key demand was that resettlement plans to be stopped. Egyptian authorities, however, in the Gaza Strip were caught off guard. And unfortunately, they responded with force. Some soldiers opened fire on the crowds, and some Palestinians were killed and injured. A name that Gaza remembers is Hosni Bilal, a Palestinian martyr whose name has been associated for decades with this 1955 uprising to call for an end for the resettlement and key measures to defend Gaza from Israeli aggression. In the aftermath of this uprising, the Egyptian government and the Egyptian administration of Gaza had no choice but to listen. Protesters in Gaza, Palestinians, formed a national committee, a coalition of Palestinian communists, Muslim Brotherhood activists, and other factions, and which then was an unlikely alliance that united by one cause: to stop the resettlement plan and protect Gaza. The committee that was established presented three clear demands to the Egyptian administration: an end to the resettlement plan, a stronger border protection with a Palestinian force, and democratic freedoms in the Gaza Strip. The Egyptian administration accepted those demands, and shortly after the protests ended, a Palestinian military force corps was established. But most importantly, the resettlement plan was fully abandoned, even though Gaza's fate remained uncertain. The 1955 uprising is often forgotten when we talk about Gaza's history, but it was one of the first moments when Palestinians in Gaza, many of them refugees, stood up not just against Israeli aggression, but also against the decisions that affected their fate. It was an assertion of their agency, a refusal to be treated as a displaced population with no voice, and it set the stage for what was to come. Mouin Bseiso would later write about Gaza as a place of struggle and unbreakable spirit. And this uprising was a testament to that spirit, the first of many times that Palestinians in Gaza would say, as Mouin Bseiso wrote in his memoirs, Dafatir Falastiniya, "We are here and we will not be erased." So this was the 1955 uprising. And just before I conclude, I just want to share a brief anecdote about how this uprising was covered and framed in the Western media, and especially in the American media. We all know how today Gaza is framed. Gaza today is framed as a hotbed for, what in the West, what Israel and supporters, call Muslim terrorism and so on. They use the anti-terror discourse to describe Gaza. This happened in the 50s, but using Cold War discourse that was focused more on communism and communist activity. And this was the key lens through which many in the United States looked at the events in Gaza. Exactly how it's talked about today, using the language of Islam and terrorism and so on. Palestinian activism in Gaza against resettlement was framed, here as Qawmi activity. The language of riots were used, and so on. So I will stop here and will pass it to Hadil, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you all.
I think you need to unmute Hadil.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. And can you see my screen?
You can do the slideshow version if you want. From the bottom, next to the Zoom thing, you just click the first one, yeah.
Okay. Okay, sorry, just 1 second. Get my notes up. Where did my Zoom screen go? Sorry, guys. Give me just a second. Get this sorted out. Can't seem to find the share screen. Okay, here we go. Is it sharing? No. Share. Can you see the slides?
We see the slides, but within the PowerPoint interface.
Okay, I'm gonna leave it like that because it takes up my whole screen, so I hope that's
No
okay.
problem.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Jihad. I always learn so much from you and have always had a very deep respect for your work, and I'm honored to be invited into this space with you. I'm going to take up the ethnic cleansing of Gaza post-1967, meaning after Israel occupied the Gaza Strip militarily, and of course, with multiple settlements that took up about a third of the Gaza Strip. But I'm going to take this up through a story that happened within my own family. I wrote a short piece about it in the London Review of Books, but also a longer piece that's in a journal that's a bit harder to find. So with the Israeli occupation of Gaza in 1967 also came an intensification of de-development of the Palestinian economy, which was another form of ethnic cleansing. As a result, many Palestinians decided to go abroad. Many went to the Gulf states, my father included. I'm sure many Palestinians in Gaza have some relatives that went to work abroad during this time. One great uncle of mine took an opportunity to work through UNRWA to go to Germany, where he still remains today. And this program only allowed one person per family to go. So later, another uncle, a great uncle of mine, his name is Mahmoud, he had just completed his training in the UNRWA vocational schools as a carpenter. And he had heard about this worker program. It was an opportunity to go work in Brazil. And the promise to work in Brazil was for a few years for a pretty high pay, especially in those days, and then to return to Gaza. So Mahmoud and several others went to the travel agencies that were set up by Israel to sign up for this worker program. This travel agency is called Petra. It's still operating in Tel Aviv today. When they landed in Brazil, however, they were not allowed to disembark and were taken on a small plane to Paraguay instead. This is Mahmoud a few years ago. Sadly, he's passed away since a few years, but this is his story that he's shared. So when they landed in the city of Asuncion, they were taken to hotels where other Palestinians were kept, Palestinians that had been transferred before him. It was then that they realized that there was no worker program. They had fallen victim to a secret Israeli transfer scheme that aimed to send 60,000 Palestinians out of Gaza and to leave them in Paraguay. This is the archival document that's in the Israeli State Archive. And you can see, it's in Hebrew, but you can see the 60,000 written there. So there was no way for them to return. Mahmoud taught himself Spanish, found work between Paraguay and Brazil before learning of the large Palestinian population in Chile, where he went for several years before making his way to Jordan. However, the transfer scheme was ongoing until May 1970, when two young Palestinian transferees from Gaza, Talal and Khalid, went to the Israeli consulate in Asuncion to confront the ambassador who was orchestrating the transfers on the Paraguayan side. This is on the left, the ambassador at the time, Benjamin Baron, who claimed that he had no idea why these Palestinians were in Paraguay. But this is, of course, not true, according to Talal, who I interviewed, and this is a picture of him on the right when he was young. For Baron arranged to have Talal and the others dumped across the border in Brazil, across the border from Paraguay, in the hopes that they would disappear. Now, according to Talal, when they came back to confront the Israeli ambassador, they were attacked by the guards. They wrestled the guns from the guards. The ambassador hid behind a secretary, and the secretary was shot and killed. Talal and Khalid, who are in this picture, Talal is in the blue, ended up in prison, and the incident was covered by the media as a premeditated attack by the PLO or Fatah, with no mention of the scheme. In court, however, Talal decided to give a long history lesson on the context that we're giving you here today, that their presence in Paraguay was part of the ongoing dispossession of Palestinians. The incident also led to the exposure of the scheme, which brought it to an end. Now, we may never know how many Palestinians were transferred this way, and Israel put a gag order on the media and the officials involved in order not to speak on it for several years, because it was seen as a failure for not having met its objectives. The first to break the story were two Israeli journalists, one of whom, Yossi Melman, I interviewed, and I'll return to that later, but they only reported on it after the gag order was lifted. The architect of this particular scheme was an Italian Zionist named Ada Sereni. She and her husband, Enzo Sereni, were both aristocrats in Italy and members of the Haganah. They had experience going to places like Iraq and other places to try to encourage Jews to migrate to what would become the State of Israel. And they illegally brought Jews from Europe during the British Mandate by ship, many of whom were also members of the Haganah and took part in the active expulsion of Palestinians from their lands. It was because of this past experience that Ada Sereni had that the Prime Minister, Evi Leshkol, who's pictured there, tapped her in order to help come up with ways to dilute the population of the Gaza Strip, because as you heard from Jihad, this was a hotbed for activism, resistance, and it was very densely populated, especially in the camps. And so they were coming up with all kinds of schemes to try to empty or dilute the population. And again, her scheme is the one that was approved in this document that I showed you. Now, the travel agency, Petra, is the one that orchestrated the transfers. It was actually founded in Palestine before the establishment of the State of Israel. And it has a long history of arranging for the traffic of weapons and people into Palestine. They were the travel agency named by Palestinian transferees in their testimonies in the Paraguay State Archives. And this is the only place where they're mentioned. So besides Mahmoud and Khalid and Talal, there were a group of other Palestinians who were transferred to Paraguay, who went to the Paraguayan government to give testimony and to request their return to Gaza. Now, the only reason, again, that we know about this travel agency's role is because of these testimonies that are found in the archives. These archives in Paraguay are nicknamed the Archive de Terror, the terror archives, because of sort of Paraguay's sordid history. And again, even the Israeli journalists who wrote about this kept many details of the scheme secret, even when they did report on it. And when I tried to interview the owners of Petra, they were proud of their past trafficking activity, but refused to speak about Paraguay when I raised the issue. In fact, they were surprised that there was any documentation tying them to this particular transfer scheme. And it was during that interview attempt that I realized that the Israeli sources kept many of the details secret as well. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is not just the literal act of physical removal, but is also enacted by so-called journalists and historians, many of whom see themselves as liberal Zionists, who feign moral concern over these acts. Some people have called this liberal Zionist behavior shooting and crying, but nonetheless have no interest in the perspective or the fate of the Palestinians, and certainly do not have a desire for Palestinians to return to their homeland. These are more of the testimonies from the archive. So I'll give one example of these historians. One is Tom Segev, a pretty well-known Israeli journalist and historian who writes a glowing description of Ada Sereni in his history of 1967 and its aftermath. In a chapter titled The Blunder in this book, he recounts the debates that the Israeli leaders were having after just occupying Gaza. And they were debating what to do with this large refugee population. Many advocated mass population transfers. Many plans were concocted to encourage Palestinian refugees to leave. Some of these were efforts to get them to work abroad in the Arab Gulf countries, as I mentioned, while others were looking for whole-scale population transfers to the Sinai. The Sinai has always been kind of there as a desire for them to push the Palestinians to. However, because of the, quote, almost existential need to believe that Zionism had caused no injustice, with this existential need to sort of show Zionism as a humane ideology, or in other words, yeah, the need to maintain the nobility of Zionism and the Jews as forever victims, the transfer operations had to be kept secret. Segev gives Sereni's history and explains her activities as a Zionist operative that facilitated these population transfers before the State of Israel was established. And after 1967, the Prime Minister appointed Sereni because of these past experiences. Only this time, her task was to send Palestinians out, and he famously said, "I want them all to go, even if to the moon." Now, Segev leaves out all the details regarding Paraguay. In fact, he doesn't mention Paraguay at all. Surely he knew of the incident at the embassy and its relation to the transfers. In fact, people keep finding this archive, Israeli scholars keep finding this document in the archives over and over again. So why did he leave it out? What did he mean by the title of the chapter, The Blunder? Quote, "As it turns out, most of the refugees did not leave Gaza in return for plane tickets or other opportunities proffered to them. For him, the blunder was the failure to disappear the refugees and for allowing them to become photogenic subjects that began to win the humanitarian world's attention and concern. Mass deportations," and I'm quoting him, "were more or less impossible because diplomats and the world press were always watching." So he concludes that the blunder is all the more surprising because Israel managed to, quote, "rehabilitate over 1 million new Jewish settlers in the course of the last 2 decades." Quote, the refugee could have been rehabilitated as well. This, he says, would not have required allowing them to return to their homes in Israel. So the blunder, in Segev's view, was Israel's failure to take advantage of the millionaires who offered to finance this rehabilitation and to give it a humanitarian veneer so that, quote, Zionist history would have seemed that much more noble. Segev never writes ethnic cleansing or colonialism in any of this chapter, or I don't know if he does in any of his work. It becomes clear that rehabilitation for Segev is the expulsion of Palestinians while preserving Zionism's image. Now, I mentioned earlier that I interviewed Yossi Melman, one of the Israeli journalists who broke the story of the transfer in 1988. Melman, a Polish Jew whose family immigrated to Israel when he was young, introduced himself to me as a liberal Zionist who was opposed to the settlements. He acknowledged that the young men were tricked, but he also argued that the problem was that it was not a well-designed plan because Ada Sereni was an amateur. Interestingly, Melman happened to be serving in the Israeli military in Gaza during this transfer scheme, but he swore he knew nothing about it until he happened to be the first to break the story, along with Dan Raviv, nearly 20 years later. Melman, like Segev, also has no interest in the perspectives of Palestinians. He never once asked me about the fate of my uncle or any of the other transferees. In fact, Melman ended that 1988 article suggesting Israel may have no choice but to expel more Palestinians. And I quote, Kahan's message, and Kahan was one of the Zionist ideologues who was advocating for the expulsion of Palestinians. Kahan's message, expel the Palestinians or risk losing Jewish control of the land, remains a potent one. And in the absence of a political solution to the Palestinian problem, Israel may be pushed towards such desperate measures. That was the ending of his English version. But in the Hebrew version, there's another ending that's absent in English that says, the weapon of expulsion is the most efficient of those that remain in Israeli hands. Now, if you'll give me just a second to give some space to the survivors of this story, Mahmoud and Talal, since I gave so much space to these Zionists, I'll just play a few clips so that we can hear from their own words. Can you guys see the video?
أنا زي ما بقولوا اتشعتلت. عارفة إيش اتشعتلت؟ يعني اتبهدلت. إخراجي من بلدي كانت خدعة كبيرة، مش بس إلي، لعدة أشخاص، حتى أسر بحال. عملوا لنا كأنه أمريكا الجنوبية عسل وسمنة، وإنه الحياة سهلة هناك، رواتب خيالية. في الوقت هذاك في 69 $3000 راتب شهري اللي أغرونا فيه، وإحنا كنا يعني شباب صغار مش فاهمين الدنيا.
كيف أنت سمعت عنه؟
طبعا الدعاية الصهيونية في قطاع غزة كانت تبث بين الشباب إنه في فرص عمل في البرازيل، وكان الاسم البرازيل فقط لا غير، لا حكوا باراغواي ولا حكوا غيره. في ناس قبلنا طلعوا بس ما كناش نعرف فيهم. بعدين تقابلنا في البرازيل، تقابلنا في مناطق تانية. والله أعلم وين هم هذول، إيش صار فيهم.
Give me a second to show you another quick clip of him. By the way, this was an attempted documentary. No. Okay, here we go.
ترجع غزة ما كانش مسموح؟
لا
ليش؟
ممنوع، خلص انتهت الفترة اللي كانت مفروض أرجع فيها مصرح لي فترة السنة في اللصيبة انتهت.
أنت مين حسب رأيك المسؤول على اللي صار له؟
طبعا دولة إسرائيل.
طب واللي في الباراغواي؟
في الباراغواي إيش دخلهم؟ مين اللي طلعني من غزة؟ مش دولة إسرائيل؟ مين اللي منحني اللصيبة مش دولة إسرائيل؟ حكومة إسرائيل.
Okay. I will say that I don't fully agree that no one in Paraguay is responsible. We just don't know who. And some journalists in Paraguay have taken this up, but we just may never know who was responsible there. And then let me introduce you to Talal, who is my uncle, Allah yarhamu, passed away a few years ago. But Talal is, and I would say he was very apprehensive about telling the story. He didn't quite see the point. Talal, on the other hand, was very eager to have his story told. Okay, let me make sure you guys can hear. Paraguay, and works as the halal. Sorry.
فيهم.
Talal stayed in Paraguay and works as the halal butcher at a major beef processing facility. He married, started a family, and has acclimated quite well into Paraguayan society. He's a sociable guy and has friends everywhere, including the prison warden's family. No one knows where Khalid is or any of the other transferees, or even how many there were. What is known is that after the incident at the embassy, the transfer program came to an end. Despite the uncertainty surrounding what actually transpired in the embassy shooting, justice was ostensibly served.
أول مرة وصلت هنا كيف كان؟
أول مرة وصلت كنت أعيط طبعا، زعلان وحمقان، ما حدش كان يزورنا ولا حد. بعد شهر جاء الدكتور بدر رشيد ليتشي عشان يزورنا ويخفف عنا الأحوال، يخفف عنا الحزن. بعدين صار يبعث للليغا como llama, libanesa y sirio, mandaban ropa, mandaban sábanas, comida, نطبخ خان، فاهمة. لكن ايش الحالات كلها كانت صعبة كثير، يعني 4 سنين قضيناها هان. اصعب شيء ان شاء الله ما حدا ياخذها، ان شاء الله ما. ايه وينهم؟ انا بدي اطلع من هان لانه
Okay, so this is the same image that Jihad shared earlier that visualizing Palestine just put out. And it's important just to remember that as Jihad explained, Mahmoud and Talal are examples of the many refugees in Gaza. They were refugees already before this happened to them. And they're refugees from their native villages that are just outside the Gaza Strip. And as many have said in their response to that man in the White House, if you want to clear out the Gaza Strip, simply return their lands that are stolen. Also, would just like to take this opportunity to encourage anyone who can access Petra, which is still operating in Tel Aviv, to continue investigating their role in expelling Palestinians. Now, the most insidious term, perhaps, was transfer, described by anti-Zionist scholar Israel Shahak as foundational to Zionism since its inception. And this notion of transfer was taken up by Noor Basalha, who wrote 2 large volumes of history about different transfer schemes and attempts to expel Palestinians. Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, argued that this idea of transfer was not the same as the expulsion of Jews from Germany, but the, quote, organized transfer of a few Arabs from a given territory to an Arab state, i.e. to the vicinity of their own people, end quote. So there's always been this sort of racist idea that Palestinians can just go to other Arab countries. So this desire to transfer Palestinians out, of course, again, they only refer to them as Arabs, was repeated by many Israeli leaders and attempted, as described by Jihad, throughout the existence of the State of Israel, and especially revived after 1967 with the aforementioned inheritance of the large population of Palestinian refugees. One of the methods that I mentioned earlier that's also rather insidious was this process of de-development of the economy. This is a term that was coined by political economist Sarah Roy to describe the deliberate destruction of the Palestinian economy, which had its precursors during the British Mandate or during British colonial rule in Palestine, which intensified Gaza's transition away from subsistence farming toward capitalist modes of production. This, she argues, laid the foundation for the underdevelopment of the Palestinian economy by the State of Israel. Britain's economic policy in Palestine fostered the so this has precursors, like Britain laid down the framework for this by fostering socioeconomic development of the Jewish sector at the expense of the Palestinian through government policies that facilitated Jewish immigration, land purchase, settlement, and capitalist development, all by giving the Zionists time to establish the institutional foundations of a pre-state structure. With the later occupation of Gaza, trade between Palestinians in Gaza and Egypt and elsewhere was severed, and measures to ensure the bureaucratic structures managing the population remained in place, including UNRWA. I should also mention that soon after 1967, in addition to numerous failed attempts to dilute the population, there was a large transfer that occurred immediately after. Under threat of facing repercussions for participating in resistance against Israel, the Palestinian Liberation Army went underground and nearly 40,000 Palestinians were expelled to Jordan on a one-way highway. And finally, I just want to say that these transfers, I'll conclude on this, never stopped. During Trump's first presidency, many were worried about an impending deal of the century, which was largely circulating by way of rumor, but was fully informed by the historical precedents of and the desire to push Gazans out, or from ongoing plans and schemes. In fact, there's a Zionist think tank called the Medium Institute that was recently proposing a so-called new state solution that would put Palestinians in southern Gaza and Sinai, all couched in humanitarian terms. But when Trump's plan was finally revealed, this was the Palestinian response then as it is now. Thank you. Stop sharing.
On that note, thank you so much, Hadil. Hala, are you having an issue with unmuting? Okay, sorry. Today I'm being somewhat muting/unmuting dictator here, and I feel bad about it.
Good, all good. Thank you so much, Jihad and Hadil. That was extremely informative and very obviously personal to all of us. So thank you for educating all of us on this. I have a question, an anonymous question, and please, for the rest, we're gonna go for another 5 to 10 minutes. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat, and you can send them to me privately if you would like to remain anonymous. So the first question that we got is, one thing Israel supporters love to say is Palestinians should not have voted for Hamas back in 2006 if they didn't want terrorism. I don't know enough about the history to give a counter argument, and I would love to be able to. So would you or your colleagues mind educating me? Like, I know Hamas won in 2006, but I don't believe it's because Palestinians want terrorism. They may be pro-resistance, but that is not terrorism. Resistance is understandable and necessary. Thank you. Jihad, if you don't mind starting with that, and then we'll go to Hadil.
mean, my answer to a question like this is pretty straightforward. The goal of this event today is to put this event in 2006, this electoral choice that Palestinians made in this broader context of the Nakba, its continuation, and this century-long effort on the part of Israel to thin out the Palestinian population, to expel Palestinians, to take over maximum Palestinian land with minimum Palestinians living in it. We can dedicate an entire event to talk about why Hamas won in 2006 and what were the factors behind people in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem voting for them in a regular legislative council election, right? This election, unfortunately, was made to be the most detrimental political event in recent Palestinian memory. Palestinians are still paying the price for casting their ballots in an election and choosing what the international community, and by the international community here I mean the United States and Israel and their allies, deemed to be an unacceptable electoral choice. And the premise of why Palestinians were punished for electing Hamas in 2006 was that Hamas does not accept the peace process, does not recognize Israel, does not recognize Israel's right to exist, and so on. And Palestinians have been punished since then. And their kids who were, like 10 years old then, 5 years old, are being punished for a round of legislative council election that they did not vote in. By that logic, if we want to extend it, then when a party like the Likud wins, majority votes in Israeli elections, and when Israelis form coalitions in the Knesset that are rooted in a completely anti-Palestinian agenda, in an agenda that not only rejects the peace accords, Oslo, and the rest, but also deny Palestinian rights, reject Palestinian statehood, and embrace the most racist, most despicable views and vision for life between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. Nobody says, let's collectively punish Israelis for their electoral choices. Nobody, the international community does not place Israel under sanctions or under a blockade. So we can talk about the circumstances of the elections itself, but there is a context that matters. And of course, the international community pushed for those elections in the name of democracy, but turned out that it wasn't about democracy. They were seeking a re-establishment of the status quo in Palestine. They wanted certain parties to win. They didn't. And that's why they set in motion this long chapter of siege, of blockade, collective punishment, recurring aggressions, in order to punish Palestinians for their electoral choice. I'll stop here, see if Hadil would like to add it.
Yeah, I'll just add that, every Palestinian leadership has been called terrorist by the West. The PLO before this, Fatah before this, the leftist PFLP. I am personally an advocate of completely abolishing the term terrorism because of its selective application. Just keep in mind that even Nelson Mandela was on the US terror list until 2008. So we really have to interrogate this term and who it's applied to and when, and push for its abolition. And in fact, pushing for the abolition of the State Departments for foreign organizations, of foreign terrorist organizations, which has every single Palestinian party present on it, with the exception of the non-military wing of Fatah. So the whole premise of this terrorism discourse is racist to the core, and we should reject it.
And as I mentioned in my presentation, regardless of how the Palestinian struggle is framed throughout history, the West will always find a way to demonize Palestinians. In the 50s, it wasn't Islamic terrorism. It was Qawmi activity, Rad activism. So the projection of Cold War insecurities and anxieties onto Palestinians centered this kind of discourse in the 50s. The PLO, was a secular. I mean, I know this term it's contested. It doesn't, for me, we need to be critical when we use a term like that. But even, it's not about which Palestinian, what kind of agenda Palestinians hold. They will, the West, Israel and its allies will always find a way to demonize them.
Yes, thank you very much, Jihad. We have one more question from Gabrielle. Is Trump's new transfer proposal, even if it doesn't happen for so many reasons, a turning point where countries like Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia realize that Israel and the US have no intention of agreeing to the two-state model and reevaluate their peace accords and geopolitical alignment? So yeah, if there's a difference on a regional level on the reaction of those countries, and we'll just give a quick response to this and then close the session because we're a bit over time. Hadil, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, I'm not really a political analyst, but I will say it has been a little surprising, the collective response from these Arab states that we haven't really seen this strongly before. And so I think that's why the last I heard, Trump started talking about sending Palestinians to Somalia and other places, because it was clearly a non-starter, to the point where Saudi Arabia said there'll be no normalization. Egypt said they're ready to stop receiving aid. Jordan even said they're willing to go to war over this. So I think there was a very strong and somewhat surprising response. I don't know, Jihad wants to add more to that.
Yeah, I mean, I've written about this on Twitter, and I'm working on a longer piece about the repercussions of not just such policies, but also such thinking. Sometimes your racism and your refusal to see Palestinians as people who are rooted in and connected to their land can backfire against you. Those Arab states know that any effort, any endeavor to move Palestinians on a large scale, any plan, any scheme to relocate Palestinians will destabilize the region, will set in motion a new era of uprising and revolution in the Arab world. This is not going to be acceptable. The Arab street is already on edge. People are angry. People are frustrated, people are tired, and millions of Arabs are not, and Muslims and Palestinians are not going to just see this happen and do nothing about it. This is the kind of endeavor that will bring down regimes, reshuffle borders, and set a new reality in motion in the Middle East. And I think this is, the Israelis are, Israeli thinking about Palestinians is that they're foreign to the land, they have no roots, no connection, they're disposable. When I was doing research in the State Department archives in College Park, I was reading meeting minutes from meetings by US officials who were discussing resettlement plans for Palestinian refugees in general and for Gaza in particular. And in one of those meetings, one official asks his colleague about whether these plans would be accepted by Palestinian refugees, whether Palestinian refugees would agree to be resettled. So this other official answers, and I vividly remember this line. It's engraved on the walls of my memory. He says, what the Arab peasant cares about is a fig tree and a vine. So give him a fig tree and a vine somewhere else, and he will be satisfied. It's not that, you know, those people come from villages where they lived, them and their ancestors for centuries. It's not that they buried their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents. It's not that they have roots in this land. It's just people are disposable according to this thinking. People are rootless. People are movable, are disposable. You can throw them away. What matters is, you know, just view them as you know, just recipients of charity and aid, hapless victims with no roots, with no names, with no stories, with no history. This is how they view us. Now, I'm positive that there are many voices within the establishment in the US and even within the Israeli security and intelligence establishment who recognize that such moves, assuming they were serious, but at the end of the day, you know, you have to brace yourself and anticipate everything from those who have access to this much power. But they know that this is going to destabilize the region. And that's why we're seeing these positions that Hadil described coming from Arab leaders and Arab governments. They know that this will be the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. So what matters here is that Palestinians are going to be rooted in their country. They're not going anywhere. And any solution, any vision for peace, justice, and stability in the region will always begin with the acknowledgement of Palestinian rights and with creating a just vision for life in the territory between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. Other than that, we're going to be in this cycle, trapped in this cycle forever.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jihad, and thank you, Hadil. Please follow Hadil and Jihad on X or Twitter. And hopefully we will have more and more of these conversations because they are quite essential. And I think the way to summarize it is for us as Palestinians, whether writers, intellectuals, activists, our eyes is on the liberation of Palestine. While they discuss continuing our ethnic cleansing, that's where our focus is. So thanks again, Jihad and Hadil. I just want us to ground ourselves for a moment after this very important discussion to remember all the martyrs in Gaza and in the West Bank and in Lebanon, the people who have died over the last 15 to 16 months, sacrificing their lives as martyrs for this cause, and for us to be able to have this conversation today. So we'll just have a small moment of silence or read the Fatiha for these people, and then we'll close the session. Great, thank you so much, and we hope to see you in future sessions. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here.